Good day. My name is David Scott. I'm a resident here with the rest of you at Carroll Lutheran Village. I was born in Yonkers, New York. My parents immigrated with their parents from Scotland. My parents were teenagers when they arrived in the United States. My family and I have kept contact with our relatives that are still in Scotland, and we have made numerous trips there for family events and a tour. Most tourists think about Scotland in terms of haggis, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the Scottish national dish, Mel Gibson and Braveheart, and Scotch whiskey. I hope today that you will learn that Scotland is more than just those three things. Those three things are important, but it's a lot more. Welcome to Scotland. This is a picture on the Isle of Skye in the northwest part of Scotland. It is very rugged, but very beautiful. Scotland is traditionally divided into two groups of people. The Highlanders up in the northern part, which is very mountainous, and the Lowlanders, which is more farming type land and two major cities. Most of the population lives to the south of that red line. My grandfather was born in Edinburgh, where on my father's side, on my mother's side, my grandfather was born in Glasgow, two of the major cities. Welcome to Scotland. The population, I'll read a little bit because this might be hard to see on your TV, is just over about 5 million people. There are more deer. It says about 661,000. I don't know how they get that accurate, but there's a lot of deer. And then there are a lot of coos. Coos are cows. Highland coos are that shaggy thing down the bottom. Sheep. There are more sheep than there are people, and they are everywhere. But even more than sheep, there are midges. Midges are these little tidy bugs that come out in June and July in the Highlands, and they bite. They are miserable. Monsters, one. That's better known as Nessie in Loch Ness. And we'll talk about Nessie later. Haggis, as I said, is the national dish. They're all over the place. If you look to the left, there's a typical bathroom type sign, but you notice the gentleman is wearing a kilt, and it's not pointing to, as they call it, the loo. It's pointing to a bog, because bathrooms are few and far between when you get up in the Highlands. On the right, it says forecast. Rain, probably. That is a very true statement. One thing that you do in Scotland is you do not let the rain stop you from doing whatever you intended to do. Scots tend to think, well, in terms of clans, which are like family, or they think in terms of we're one people. Well, that is not true if you really go back and do the research on families. They are a mixture of people from places. If you look at this particular slide, the purple, the Norse, they obviously come from Denmark or other parts of Scandinavia. The blue, the Picts, they came from the northern side of the Rhine. What we might think of is up towards where it used to be East Germany, Poland, so on and so forth. The Brits, that orange down the bottom, they came from the south side of the Rhine, going down towards the Alps, going down towards Italy and France. Why such a mixture? Well, if you look at the whole topography of the United Kingdom, and you have migrations coming out of Africa, coming across Europe, and then they came across the Channel, and they moved up and up and up through the United Kingdom until they got to what's now called Scotland, and it was the end. There wasn't any further you could go to the west, and so they settled there. This is Sean Connery, or Sir Sean Connery. And for you that might be able to not read what it says on the right of this slide, I am not an Englishman. I was never an Englishman, and I don't ever want to be one. I am a Scotsman. I was a Scotsman, and I always will be one. A lot of Scots would agree with what he said. This is a portrait of a traditional Highlander in the yesteryears. Over the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about kilts and Scottish dress. The gentleman on the right is what you'd more likely see in Scotland today, pointing out normal jacket, tie, that's the thing. There's a little kilt pin down at the bottom to keep your kilt from blowing open. But what confuses most people is that thing in the center called a sporran. In reality, it is his pocketbook or where he keeps his money. Kilts do not have pockets. To show you a traditional Scottish wedding, the lady in the blue hat is my second cousin, Elizabeth, but who I keep in constant contact with email and by telephone. She and I are very close. We don't even consider ourselves second cousins. We consider ourselves brother and sister. You may have seen her and her husband, who's to the right of her, Clive, here on campus last fall. They came and saw us for about a week. This is her family, two sons, the son in the center who was getting married, and we had the privilege of being at the weddings of both of those gentlemen and their daughter-in-laws. Not to be outdone, the tall one is my son, Keith, and that's myself. You can see my sporran. There's a little story that goes with my sporran that I almost got in trouble with. It is made of an endangered species product. It was my great-grandfather's. It dates back to around 1860. The last time I was in Scotland, they said you can't have that because it's an endangered species. So I had to wrap it up and smuggle it back out of the country. Needless to say, when I go back, I now use a sporran much like my son's. Again, I'll read it. I generally don't read slides, but since you might be small on your TV set, I will. Kilt. It is what happened to the last person who called it a skirt. Need I say more? Again, I'll read. If it's a kilt, it's a kilt if I wore something under it. If it didn't, then it would be a skirt. If you're invited to a Scottish wedding, either drink a lot or stay off the dance floor. This is Scottish country dancing, or called a keeley. Many of the dances are similar to doing square dancing with two differences. One, they are done at very, very high speed, and there isn't a caller. And everybody that is at the dance that is from Scotland has learned these dances from the time they were a young child. So when you get out on the floor, you haven't got an idea what the steps are, but you just start going and twirling and having a lot of fun. But it can get a little dangerous. Many of you have heard the bagpipe. Bagpipes, particularly when people are practicing, they should go do it off in the woods because it makes awfully screeching sounds. But then, like a lot of things, it plays very beautiful music. What I wanted to point out was the bag is made traditionally of the stomach of a sheep. They don't put anything to waste in Scotland. So the bagpipe, generally, today, it's probably not a sheep's stomach, but something synthetic. Highland Games. We have them here in the United States. People like my grandparents used to drag me to the Scottish Games in New York all the time. Here in the United States and here in Maryland, we have a very large Scottish Games. It should have been next month, but it's probably been canceled down in Calvert County. No, the men are not having a tug of war with those young lasses, as the girls are called in Scotland. But that's where the tug of war started. Then you have the traditional tossing of the hammer, much like things you see in the Olympic Games. But the picture on the upper right corner is not one you see in the Olympic Games. It's unique to Scotland. It's called tossing the caber. See this gentleman, he's holding what looks like a telephone pole. Believe me, when you see it up tight and up close and personal, it looks just like a telephone pole. He lifts that up, he runs forward about 5 paces, and then he flips it, or tries to flip it. The objective of this particular sport is to flip it end over end. The first gentleman that does it wins. If you go through the whole group of people that try it and nobody can do it, they cut a foot off and they start again. And it keeps going until somebody can flip the entire caber, as it's called, over end on end. I was in the U.S. Navy, and I always like to pull the strings of my friends that are Marines. Took a bunch of Marines to carry that caber, while it only takes one guy in Scotland. Hogmanay. Hogmanay is New Year's. It is a large celebration, probably the largest celebration in Scotland on New Year's Eve. It's a celebration. Look at all those torches of light, because at this time of year, it is very, very dark in Scotland most of the day. It gets light around 10:30 in the morning, and it's dark by 2:30 in the afternoon. So they are celebrating the fact that light is coming back. Now, conversely, in the summer, you only get about 3 hours of darkness. I've been there at 12 midnight, and it's like it's 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun is shining bright. It goes down, and it's back up by about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. Food. Need to always talk about food in these presentations. In the upper left-hand corner are Empire biscuits. I used to love, I still do, loved them as a kid. My grandmother used to make them. In the center are scones. Not these scones that we get here in the United States. There's a big difference. But scones is something I love. And then shortbread. I'm very thankful that my grandmother taught my wife how to make good shortbread. We then go down to the lower left and a traditional Scottish breakfast. There are some things on there that are not to my taste. My father loved every bit. Anyway, if you look around, you got sausages. They call them bangers. You got ham that's underneath over there to the right. That's called gammon. You got potato pancake. You got beans. You got traditional egg. But the other thing that's on there that, well, besides the tomato, that I do not like is blood pudding. The blood over grain from a cow, from a sheep. Not my favorite dish. In the center, you have salmon. Salmon is probably the delicacy in Scotland. If you go to a home and they serve you salmon, they have great respect for you. And then you can go to the local bakery and get Scottish sausage rolls. That's the snack. That probably was the hamburger of Scotland before McDonald's came to be in Scotland. However, my theory is that some of Scottish cuisine, particularly blood pudding and others, are based on a dare to eat them. The national dish of Scotland is a type of pudding composed of a liver, heart, and lungs of a sheep, or perhaps another animal, minced and mixed with beef or mutton. Suet, mutton is sheep, and oatmeal and seasoned with onion, cayenne pepper, and other spices. This is called haggis. They love it. I don't eat it. This is the traditional image of housing in Scotland, a crofter's cottage. But that would be very wrong. It'd be like thinking of prairie type homes back when the settlers went west in the United States. These are the houses that you traditionally see around Scotland. But I would suggest to you, don't judge the outside of a house. Like a book, don't judge it by its cover. If you particularly look at that rather not very austere set of apartment buildings down in the lower right, you might say, this is what it looks like inside. They don't build a lot of new houses in Scotland. They take houses that are sometimes hundreds of years old, gut them, refurbish them, and modernize them. I think you would agree this looks like almost an American house inside with very high-end appliances. I'm not in love with the covering on the chairs, but that's their style. Stores. Traditionally, when we lived in England, this was the type of thing that you went to. You'd go to the local fish and chips, you would go to the news store to pick up your newspaper, or you would go to the butcher's, so on and so forth, various little shops. Back in the 60s when we lived in England, there weren't a lot of supermarkets. Today, this is a traditional shopping center. It looks much like the United States. The only difference is a couple of stores that are different. The M&S is down there is called Marks and Spencer. That is a chain of stores throughout the UK. Used to be a great place to buy woolen sweaters. I would note, you probably can't see it, but up on the second floor in the back, McDonald's is there. You go anywhere in the UK today, particularly in Scotland, and you'll find McDonald's. Remember, it didn't start in Scotland. It started in San Diego, California. You might recognize a few stores. Yes, Safeway is there with their big mega store. Five Guys, great hamburgers here in the United States. They're in Scotland. And then there's McDonald's. Esso, that's Exxon. Remember when it used to be called Esso here? And you have Walmart, a supercenter. Now they're joined up with a German firm, and then you have Marks and Spencer again. And yes, Amazon is there. And you have Amazon Prime. 2 days delivery. Again, reading, the Bible says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and it was called a disaster. Here in Scotland, we call it summer. Another term used in Scotland is rain is liquid sunshine. Another saying is today's rain is tomorrow's whiskey, because the whiskey gets its taste from the rain going across the countryside and picking up various mineral content. This is one of the larger distilleries in Scotland. There are a number of distilleries, small, most of them small, in the Highlands. I used to see these trucks and wonder what they were. When I found out, I was amazed. That truck is carrying Scotch whiskey. Only 3 of the major distilleries bottle their own at their facilities. Most distilleries distill and then age the whiskey, and then it's transported to 2 locations, one in Edinburgh and one in Glasgow, that do the bottling. Hate to see this truck get into an accident and whiskey all over the road. We're going to start our journey around Scotland by going to a place called Hadrian's Wall. Although the Romans were able to come up all the way through the UK and left a lot of history throughout the nation, it only got up into close to the Highlands. And then it retreated. And it retreated and it built a wall across the lower part of Scotland, separating Scotland from England. That wall is called the Hadrian's Wall. And it was designed to keep those Moravian Scots who used to go into England and raid farms and villages and so on out. There were folks that live along that wall that live here or work here at CLV. And if you look just above the H in Hadrian's, that's where John Henry's folks are from. And now you can see why. He was from a family that were a bunch of thieves and raiders that went across and made their living by stealing from the English. This is Hadrian's Wall today. It's much more than a bunch of rock built up. There are other parts of the wall that are made out of earth, and the Roman troops were stationed about every half mile. But John Henry's folks always found a way to get through. If you heard my presentation on Yorkshire, you know I talked about heather. The left slide here is of heather, which comes out in late August, early September. The picture on the right is of what we call New Forest. During World War II, most of the trees in England, and including Scotland, were cut down for the war effort. There was a large reforestation effort that occurred after World War II. But they also planted wildflowers amongst the new forests. And it's gorgeous to behold at this time of year. This is the town or city of Edinburgh. As I mentioned earlier, my grandfather on my father's side was born there. If you look down at the buildings, those apartments, houses, flats as they call them, it's not where my grandfather was born, but that's the physical location where my grandfather was born in 1888. Unfortunately, both his mother and father died in a plague. When I think about the virus going on today, I think about the plague that killed his mother and father. In the far distance, you'll see a little hill, and we're going to come to that. That's the famous Edinburgh Castle. The water over to the right is called the Firth of Forth. In our language, we call that the Bay of Forth. Edinburgh is a very pretty town. It's upper end town, meaning that it is a financial center. It's more of a white collar town, whereas the other city, Glasgow, has always traditionally been more of a blue collar town. The picture on the right is part of the old town of Edinburgh. Picture on the left is Old Town. The picture on the right is a bunch of townhouses. As one of them is very, very memorable to us. It's a Mrs. Davidson's bed and breakfast. And when we go to Edinburgh, we used to stay at at that bed and breakfast. This is Princes Street. You're going to see on the right, in a minute, to the right, there's a big garden, a park, and then the castle that is very world famous. But this is the main shopping street. In England, they would call it the High Street. But that edifice, dark edifice off to the right, is the monument to Sir Walter Scott, which Queen Victoria dedicated back in the late 1800s. It is quite an interesting thing to go up inside it. There are 287 steps, stone steps, and the further you go up, it gets narrower and narrower. I weighed a lot less in the days when this picture was taken. I was able to go all the way up to the top, and I was able to take pictures looking around Edinburgh. I came down, again, backing down the 287 steps. It's a height of 200 feet, by the way, all the way up. And got to the bottom, and I looked at my camera and realized that I had put a fresh roll of film in, but had not advanced. So none of the pictures I took that day came out. I never climbed back up, and I couldn't do it today. This is Edinburgh Castle. As I say, the picture's taken from Princes Street, looking over a garden. It's very pretty. You see the tulips growing here. It's springtime when this picture was taken. But this used to be a terrible spot for several reasons. Back in the 1800s or in the 1700s and 1800s, it was a big, almost cesspool. All the drains in Old Town Edinburgh used to empty it into it, and it was a big lake. Lake that probably caused a lot of disease. But it also had a problem historically. Over 300 women lost their lives in that lake. Women who were decreed to be witches were bound and thrown into the lake. If they surfaced, they were considered to be real witches, and they were killed at the stake. If they didn't, they died, but oh, I guess she wasn't a witch. Some crazy things that we do as a human race. Edinburgh Castle is built on top of an extinct volcano. It was built in the 12th century, and it is still a very active military base, although very white-collar military base. Every time I look at this picture, I say, what fool would ever try to capture that castle by climbing up that rock while people are throwing or pouring things all over you that are not very nice? This is an aerial picture of the castle. The building, you'll see there's a flagpole, a white flagpole, to just the building to the right of it, is where the crown of the Scottish king or queen is kept. It is only used when the queen or king, if there was a king, comes to Scotland. It stays in Scotland, and it stays here within the castle. This is where the knights used to put on their armor, but this is one of the internal rooms of the castle. And there's a picture of the Scottish crown. Not the English crown, the Scottish crown. The Edinburgh Tattoo. In August, outside they build this great amphitheater, and there are pipe bands that come from all over the world, as well as other military organizations. But it's a musical program that goes on every night for about 2.5 hours. The attendance over that month is around 200,000 people. But what is amazing to me is on one night, the final night, it is shown to over 100 million people around the world on TV. Unfortunately, it's not broadcast here in the United States. If you go to Canada, you can watch it. But you can also see it if you have a computer and you go to YouTube. You can look at various years of the Scottish tattoo, or the Edinburgh Tattoo. We moved down just slightly, maybe about 500 yards from the castle, and we come to St. Giles Cathedral. This church was founded, not this one being built, but it was a church originally there, started in the year 1124. In the 16th century, it became the focal point for the Scottish Reformation. The church is regarded as the mother church of world Presbyterianism. John Knox, the foremost leader of Scottish Reformation, who set the austere moral tone for the Church of Scotland and shaped the democratic form of government it adopted. He was both the minister of St. Giles and a leader of the Presbyterian Church. This is the interior of the church with a very, very pretty stained glass window. The church is to the right. This cobblestone area is called the Royal Mile, and it goes from the castle down a hill, approximately a mile, to another castle or palace, which is the Queen's residence when she is in Edinburgh. When she is in Edinburgh and she wants to wear that crown, there's a major procession bringing the crown down this roadside to her palace. The building on the left is called the Palace of Holyrood. It is her official residence. As I said, it's located at the bottom of the hill at the end of the Royal Mile, and it is served as the principal residence of the kings and queens of the UK since the 16th century. 16th century is not a fun thing for Scots because it was then that Scotland was forced into union with England. Prior to that, it had been its own country. A large majority of Scots wish that would happen again. In 1994, the British Parliament voted that for the first time in over 200 years, local governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland could legislate things for their local people. As such, parliaments were created in each of those three areas. This is the Scottish Parliament. I found it amusing that they built it right next door to the Queen's Palace, sort of saying, we're going to be back as a separate country. This is a picture of the head of the Scottish National Party. She is known as, her first name is Nicola. She is a very, very dynamic woman. And if Scotland is to get independence from the UK, which many of us hope will happen, she will be the person that will make it happen. We now leave Edinburgh, which is down at the bottom of this map. We're going to go across a narrow part of the Firth of Forth, and we're going to go up to St. Andrews, and then we're going to go up to Perth. This is the Firth of Forth Bridge. It's actually a railroad bridge. It is about 1,800 foot long, and it was one of the first cantilever bridges made in the world. It was completed in 1890. When the Scots build something, it stays. Today, there are over 150 trains a day that cross this bridge. In recent times, there have been two other bridges built down the Forth, just slightly from the railroad bridge. And Carol and I have been across these bridges more times than I want to count. We now move to St. Andrews. St. Andrews is a little village. It's also where the future king, removed by two, he still got his father to go through. William went to school with Kate and went to the University of St. Andrews. But it's more famous for its golf course. It's a public golf course. And it's open to all. You could go there and you could play golf there for a mere $250 greens fees. We now move to the central part, north central part of Scotland, and to a city called Perth. It's a very lovely little city in the central part. And this is a salmon fishing river. Well, you see people out there, as this gentleman is, trying to catch his dinner. But I'm going to give you a fact that you would probably never think about. Pontius Pilate, known for the trial and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, was actually born in Perth. His father commanded the Roman guard. His mother came along with his father, and they lived in Perth until they retreated south of Hadrian's Wall. This is a picture actually in Westminster Abbey with a stone below it. But the stone has a history. The stone used to be located in Perth, and it would be when a Scottish king was crowned, he would sit, or she as the queen would sit on that stone. Unfortunately, in the 16th century, when forcibly Scotland was connected with those people down south called English, the stone was taken to Westminster Abbey. Part of my family is notorious because of this stone. In the early 1950s, 4 young men in their early 20s, one of them being one of my relatives, on New Year's Eve, broke into Westminster Abbey and stole the stone of Scone and brought it back to Scotland. There was hue and cry. police knew it had gone back to Scotland, and they had a pretty good clue who stole it, but they couldn't find out. And that is because the youths brought it back and brought it up into the Highlands and buried it on a farm in the ground. And this went on for several years, until finally the four youths were given immunity, and it was an agreement that the stone would return to Westminster Abbey on loan from Scotland. And if Scotland asked for it back, if it ever got independence, it would be returned. We now move further up the coast. This would be the East Coast, to an area where my father in a little town called Montrose was born, and an area that is very pretty and very special to me. First couple of times going north, I just couldn't figure out what this yellow plant that you see in August and September. It's called rapeseed. And all up and down the East Coast, you'll see farms growing this rapeseed. The oil from the plants is used to make salad dressing and mayonnaise. And it has a great taste. As you go, as I say, if you go up and down the East Coast, you'll see lots of farms growing rapeseed. This body of water, well, the body of water on the far part of the slide is the North Sea. This basin here is called the Montrose Basin. That spit of land on the other side is the town of Montrose, where my father was born. The reason I put this in, this is a very, very popular at this time of year for bird watching, this basin, because birds will fly in from Scandinavia, land here, sort of get fat again, and then move on over to Europe and to all the way down as far as Africa in their summer, going to their winter locations. I leave that up for a couple of seconds and ask you, what do you think that's a picture of? It's a golf course. It's the Montrose Golf Course. It is the 5th golf course ever built in the world. It is still a public golf course today. When my father was a teenager, he used to caddy on this particular golf course. Unfortunately, because of global warming, you can see the North Sea over to the right, on the right picture. That beach is starting to get eaten away, and although this golf course has been here for a long time, it is threatened. I stopped in Montrose because, not just because my father was born there, but it is an important economic center. This is the harbor coming into Montrose, and those ships support the drilling rigs out in the North Sea. The map on the right, all those little yellow squares and the blue dots, represent oil and gas rigs. Montrose supplies them not only from these ships, but helicopters that take the crews out. They're out there for 2 weeks at a time, and then they come home. One of the things that has annoyed the Scots is all that oil and gas comes into Scotland, but mostly goes to England. The Scots don't get a lot of money for it. That's not fair. We move further up the coast. And this is another one of these castles where I say, how can you possibly try to take it over and go up those cliffs? Today in Scotland, you can go around and there are over 3,000 castles that you can visit. We now move inland And this is Balmoral Castle. You may have heard of Balmoral Castle. The Queen, every year in July and August, to get away from the heat of London, this is where she stays. It is actually a very working farm. It raises sheep, it raises cattle, and it raises racehorses. It's a relatively new castle. It was built in the late 1800s by Queen Victoria. We're now going to move up into the northwest part of Scotland, actually central northwest. Down at the top, Inverness, Lake, various lochs. Lochs are what we call lakes, going down to Fort William. These strange looking stones are just south of the city of Inverness. By the way, Inverness is probably the largest city in the north of Scotland. The stones were erected by the Druid people in the 2nd century. And pretty much until recently, people didn't, there's lots of these kinds of stones all around Scotland and some around England. Stonehenge is another one. But people didn't really pay much attention to them. But that changed a few years ago when a series of books that are historical novels that use the stones as a means of starting time travel. The book and subsequent TV series, which you can see on Netflix, is called Outlander. It's a great show. It has a lot of lovey-dovey stuff, but it has a lot of adventure. And there's some squeamish parts, but overall it's a great show, and I recommend it if you can get Netflix. There are two characters in the TV show and in the books, Jamie and Claire. Personally, I do not see why women, and they do, swoon over Jamie. He's the one on the left. Personally, Claire is my favorite. But these two actors who are not married to each other, but they have terrific chemistry that you almost believe they are in love with each other. Outlander is set in the rugged Highlands where the clans fought the English. And as you can see, it is a very lonely, but again, very, very beautiful landscape. But if you're driving your car, particularly on this road, beware. The road is one lane. See, there's only one car going up there. And it's a game of chicken if somebody is coming the other way. You'll see these little bump outs, or they call lay-bys. If somebody's coming the other way, one of you has to back up to go into one of these lay-bys to let the other go by. Don't drive fast. In the Highlands, you see a lot of animals. The one on the right, you say, that's a deer. We call it a stag in Scotland. Talked about early on, coos. This is the Scottish cattle. For many years, there's lots of open land. You can call it moorland or whatever in the north of Scotland. In the Highlands, no fences. The coos used to roam. Well, if you hit one of those, you not only destroy the animal, you destroy your vehicle. So most of the coos are now in fenced areas. I talked about there being more sheep, and they are all over the place. Again, you got to be careful driving that you don't hit one because they roam free. Most of you might have recognized me as I walk every day around the campus, all the way down around 201, 205, and come back up to Weller Way. I walk my dog, Baird, which is my middle name, by the way, and he's a golden retriever. 2 years ago, they had 150 golden retrievers in a field, which is the picture in the lower right corner. It was to celebrate the origination of the breed some 150 years ago in Scotland. Coos are very popular with the tourists, and so this little slide I thought was great. Come on, son, I'll teach you how to be cute for the tourists. Probably saying, are we back in the Netherlands? Well, Scotland, like a lot of European countries, are doing their best to fight the war against global warming. As you go through the Highlands today, you'll see on mountaintops or hilltops these windmills. They have achieved a 42% reduction in fossil fuel emissions by this year. They intend to be off of fossil fuel by 2030. They also intend to have only electric cars in the country by 2030. No gasoline, or as they call them, petrol cars. Told you we'd come to Loch Ness. And if you look out off of that point, you might see Nessie the monster. The myth of Nessie brings a lot of tourists to this area. And people swear that Nessie is there. Could be. It's a very, very deep loch or lake. On average, it's about 750 feet deep. And it goes for 23 miles. It's fed by a river from the north. It feeds into a river going into the North Sea. You can see it. Nessie could easily hide in that Great Lake. But one theory that probably has a lot of validity, the Nessie is not a large monster. They believe that it is some giant eels, and there are giant eels in the Atlantic Ocean that came up through the river and got trapped into the lake. That's why you sometimes see this strange shape that they purport to be the monster. This is Loch Ness on what we call a good day. Notice it's raining. And if you go there, be prepared for the liquid sunshine. This is a fantastic day. If you get one of those days, consider yourself very, very lucky. We now moved down from Loch Ness to a place called Fort William, a place very famous in history, but it's an area that has a very distinct memory for me. My son is now 46 years old. He doesn't like this story, but when he was about 8 years old, there's a path that goes to the top of Ben Nevis. Ben Nevis is the highest mountain in Scotland. And we were proceeding to climb up this very wet and muddy pathway to the top. Our son ran ahead. And after a little bit, he said, well, I better go catch up with him. It took me an hour to catch up with him. Probably take me 10 hours to catch up with him today. But I almost killed him on the spot. It stuck as a permanent memory. But when you get to the top, the picture is a beautiful scene looking out over the Highlands. We now move to Glasgow, and as I mentioned earlier, this is where my grandparents and mother's family is from, in the Glasgow area. Glasgow used to be a blue-collar town, very famous for shipbuilding, and it's where many, many Scots left. This is the River Clyde that goes out into the Irish Sea, left from here to come to the United States and Canada. After World War II, actually in the early 50s, shipbuilding decreased. There are places in the world that could build ships much cheaper, the labor rates were cheaper. And the town became very dirty and grimy, and it was not a place that you wanted to go. Starting in the 1980s, it had a rejuvenation. It reinvented itself. It is now one of the fastest growing cities in Great Britain. There is a lot of high tech. There's a lot of high tech buildings. The building in the lower center is BBC Scotland. Across the Clyde is a very, very interesting science museum. But ships are starting to be built again in Glasgow, more high-tech ships. These 4 vessels were being built to haul that natural gas out of the North Sea to other parts of the world. Most of us here in the States know about a place called Silicon Valley. In my career, I was very involved in microelectronics and spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, which is just slightly to the south of San Francisco. Well, Scotland has Silicon Glen, with National Semiconductor, Texas Instrument, Microsoft, so on and so forth, all having facilities there. They're there to export to Europe. Unfortunately, with the UK deciding that they don't want to continue to become part of the European Union, these firms are going to start to leave Scotland, and it's going to be an economic loss. That's why Scotland wants its independence. It wants to remain a member of the European Union. I showed you a very pretty country that is very near and dear to me. Yes, the United States is near and dear to me. I served this country for over 40 years in the US government and military. But Scotland has done a lot for the world and done a lot for the United States. This is a saying by Winston Churchill. Of all the small nations of this earth, perhaps the ancient Greeks surpassed the Scots in their contribution to mankind. This gentleman is known as James Logie Baird. You may recognize that my middle name is Baird. James was a Scottish engineer, an innovator, and the inventor of television. He demonstrated the first working television system on January 26, 1926. And he was the inventor also of colored television. He was not the only inventor that brought me. This slide has lots of things that the Scots invented. Because some of you can't see it, I'll go through and just say a couple of them. Penicillin, insulin, radar, saline drip. It was the father of modern economics. They invented the hypodermic syringe, ultrasound scanner, radiation therapy, beta blocker drugs, the flush toilet. I won't tell you the name of the gentleman that invented it, but it was invented there. And guess what? They also invented the refrigerator. Scotland is almost also famous for its writers. So the statue to Robert Scott, but we have Treasure Island, Peter Pan, Ivanhoe, so on and so forth. And we can't forget the Bard of Scotland, Robert Burns. But what has Scotland done for the United States? I know they sent my family here and they still ask forgiveness for that. But Scotland has been very close to the United States since the United States' beginning. 56 signatories of the Declaration of Independence. A third were Scots by birth or Scottish descent. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, you will find in several parts of it words that were taken from the Declaration of Aberystwyth, which was a document written in 1320, long before the Declaration of Independence, where the Scots deployed English rule. The words were taken right for that document and put into our Declaration of Independence. There's been a lot of immigration from Scotland into the United States. If you go to those areas in blue, you will find a lot of descendants who are tracing their genealogy back to Scotland. This is a list of presidents of the United States. Every one of these presidents can trace their family roots back to Scotland. This is my final slide. My favorite. Child, a baby, waking up and smiling, realizing that he's Scottish, and saying, thank you and bye. This is my golden retriever. I thank you. Please keep all of the people of the staff here at COV in your prayers, particularly those working in the healthcare center as they tend to those that are sick with the virus and trying to keep the virus away from those that do not have it. And hopefully the staff does not become sick. They go in there every day like firemen, fighting a fire, fighting the virus. And we are very, very privileged to have such a dedicated group working here at COV. If you see them, say thank you. They are the best. Have a good day. Stay safe. Stay home. And if not, wear a mask. I'll see you next week.